3:24 a.m. Washington time. A low-resolution thermal bloom appeared on U.S. early warning satellites, an explosion, large, unregistered, and dangerously close to a Soviet Delta-class submarine operating beneath the Barents Sea. Inside the Situation Room, tension spiked. It could be a reactor failure, or it could be a missile test gone wrong, or worse, an unconfirmed American weapon detonation in Soviet waters. Within 90 seconds, the decision was made: activate the hotline. Send a crisis clarification message to Moscow. De-escalate before assumption spiral. Message drafted, authorized, transmitted through the secure teletype cable buried beneath the Atlantic seabed. And then, nothing. And 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 90. No reply from the Soviet end, no confirmation receipt, no return signal, and worse, no alternative channel active. Inside the National Security Council, anxiety mounted. One analyst suggested trying the backup embassy channel. Another ordered NSA to initiate satellite relay, but even those required coordination from the Soviet side, which remained silent. At 04:12 a.m., NORAD reported increased Soviet radar activity in the Murmansk region. 04:29, multiple long-range bomber bases in Belarus shifted to full readiness. 05:00 US. Navy ELINT aircraft logged encrypted burst transmissions consistent with pre-launch codes moving through Soviet air command nets. The silence was not just deafening, it was escalating. And in Moscow, the problem wasn't aggression, it was confusion. A junior signal officer at the Ministry of Communications stared at a blank terminal. The hotline printer hadn't fired. The fax lines showed no handshake. The satellite link was still in sleep mode. Reports came in of U.S. military movements, but no context, no explanation, no message. And so Soviet commanders filled the gap the only way they knew how, with doctrine. They raised alert levels. They scrambled reconnaissance aircraft. They queried units to verify weapon status. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that a critical component of the transatlantic cable system had corroded in a junction box near Greenland. A voltage spike triggered a safety cutoff. A silent breaker flipped. The most important line of communication between two nuclear superpowers had failed. No alarm, no backup signal, just one break, and 3 hours of silence. By dawn, two nuclear-ready units had entered full combat posture, all because a single message never arrived. It would take days to piece together what happened. But in that moment, in those dark, silent hours, the most fragile truth of the Cold War was exposed. The world can burn before anyone picks up the phone. When the red phone rang in Cold War thrillers, it was always direct, instant. A clean connection between two men, two desks, two decisions. But the real hotline, the one established after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was nothing like the myth. There was no phone, no voice, no immediate response. Instead, there was a teletype machine, linked through a web of undersea cables, satellite relays, encryption units, and human operators. Every message passed through a process of translation, authentication, duplication, and physical relay. Messages had to be typed, encoded, sent, received, decoded, and printed in Washington. This process was known. It was cumbersome, but reliable until the night it wasn't. The assumption on both sides was simple. If crisis struck, the hotline would function. If it didn't, someone would notice. There were protocols, alerts, redundancies. In theory, a failure would trigger alarms, initiate failovers, shift to secondary lines, but in practice, no such alarms were wired to the physical cable junctions. No real-time diagnostics had been installed on the aging Atlantic segments. A critical relay hub in Greenland operated on 1960s voltage protocols never upgraded, and no one, in any capital, had tested real-world wartime traffic over the line in over a year. The USSR, for its part, believed the system was protected. Backup links were routed through diplomatic posts, satellite bursts, even coded naval signals, but each assumed that a decision had been made to use them. None activated automatically. In short, every backup still required trust, and trust, in the moment of potential war, is the first thing to evaporate. The Soviet command believed the Americans were sending nothing. The Americans believed the Soviets were ignoring everything. Both were wrong, and both were victims of a shared delusion that technology would behave in crisis the same way it behaved in drills. A classified review after the incident noted a disturbing irony. The hotline was designed to prevent war through rapid clarity. It failed by creating silence faster than any missile could launch. Washington had assumed the message was received. Moscow assumed the message had never been sent. And neither realized that their greatest safeguard meant to stop a nuclear catastrophe had turned into the most dangerous blank space on Earth. Because when the world depends on a single cable and no one's watching the line, no one knows when it breaks. Soviet nuclear doctrine, codified through decades of strategic planning, relied on precision timing: 10 minutes to verify a threat, 20 minutes to establish intent, 30 minutes to coordinate response. It was built on the assumption that information would flow, even in chaos. But doctrine isn't a weapon, it's a script. And on the night of the Barents incident, the script didn't match the stage. By 03:45 Moscow time, radar stations along the Kola Peninsula began picking up high-altitude U.S. surveillance flights. Routine. Yes, but paired with reports of American naval units, changing posture. It looked off. When Central Command asked for a context update from the Foreign Ministry, the answer came back cold. No communication received. Doctrinal flowchart activated. No comms from Washington escalate to readiness level 2. Query missile divisions for launch capability status. Prepare ground crews. Double-check NORAD activity. But behind every check mark was guesswork. The playbook demanded movement without answers. In the absence of clarity, the Soviet machine didn't freeze, it accelerated. Because according to the book, if the Americans weren't speaking, it was already too late. In theory, de-escalation could still be triggered. The system allowed for pause. But here's where the real fracture emerged. The people reading the doctrine didn't trust it. Too many drills had failed. Too many generals had been reprimanded for waiting too long in simulations, so they acted. Submarines were ordered to surface to show presence. Air defense networks rerouted power toward northern sectors. 2 ICBM units in central Russia were moved to warm standby, meaning they could be fueled and targeted in under 20 minutes. No order to launch had been given, but everything around it had already started moving, and at the center of it all, a terrifying contradiction, the Soviet system was trying to follow a rule book that required communication while being starved of it. The very doctrine designed to prevent miscalculation was now manufacturing it. A colonel in the Strategic Rocket Forces reportedly whispered to his deputy that night, "We've trained for this moment our whole lives, but not like this. Not without knowing." The flaw wasn't in readiness, it was an assumption that if the Americans wanted to talk, they could. That if there was a crisis, a message would arrive. That war wouldn't begin in the void. But war doesn't need a launch command. Sometimes it just needs a delay. And doctrine, once broken, doesn't shatter loud. It dissolves quietly. IO 3:26 a.m. EST-me, the first hotline message from Washington, was sent an encrypted teletype transmission alerting the Soviet General Staff to a possible naval reactor explosion and warning that upcoming U.S. force movements were defensive. It never arrived. 03:41 a.m. A second message was dispatched via a secondary transmission node in Frankfurt, routed through NATO channels. Also failed. The Soviets had not switched their diplomatic relays to high readiness status, assuming the hotline would suffice. At 04:02, a third attempt was made, this time through the U.S. Embassy's cipher unit in Moscow. A secure diplomatic packet was encoded, authenticated, and transmitted via courier to Soviet Foreign Ministry intake. It arrived at 05:57 local time. By then, the Soviet General Staff had already mobilized forward airfields, activated several mobile missile launchers in Siberia, and raised command readiness levels at 3 northern radar sectors. Washington didn't know any of this. What they saw was absence, no confirmation, no reply, no signal. And from a Cold War standpoint, no response meant escalation. At 04:45 a.m., the White House convened its emergency communications triad. The options were grim delay further and risk miscalculation. Or shift to visible deterrence move, use the bombers into airborne patrol. Force Moscow to pick up the signal through action. The president hesitated. He had a report from the NSA suggesting Soviet radar traffic had tripled in 2 hours. NORAD indicated Soviet AWACS platforms were vectoring patrols toward the Arctic Gap, yet still no reply. Someone floated the unthinkable. The Soviets may be jamming the hotline, a first step before decapitation. Back in Moscow, that exact theory was forming in reverse. The Americans had disappeared from the comms net. Were they hiding something? Testing response time, a decapitation drill. One Soviet Navy admiral reportedly demanded the activation of Operation Flare Echo, a wartime procedure to flood NATO SIGINT channels with noise and assess their reaction. It was denied, barely. The truth. Meanwhile, sat in a dusty relay facility beneath Greenland, where a corrupted circuit board had failed to reroute voltage, a $10 component. Never updated, never reported, because in over 2 decades, the hotline had never been stress-tested under real-world load. And now, under stress, it wasn't just broken, it was invisible. The impossible had happened. The system, built to prevent catastrophe, had vanished precisely when catastrophe came closest. In the Kremlin's high command bunker, disbelief turned to fury. By 06:10 a.m. Moscow time, the situation was critical. No word from Washington, no updates from the Soviet embassy in D.C., no hotline teletype, no satellite message relay. But reports were flooding and American radar signatures were shifting. Naval groups had repositioned in the North Atlantic. AWACS aircraft had doubled coverage over Norway to Soviet generals. The silence was too coordinated to be a technical glitch. They didn't believe it was broken. They believed it was deliberate. General Mikhailov, head of Strategic Air Defense, paced the war room floor as data feeds flashed. He demanded an update from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The reply chilled the room, Washington not responding via standard channels. No activity on the hotline. No anomaly detected. No explanation. That was worse than confirmation of an attack, because it meant no one in Moscow could prove anything. The U.S. might be posturing, or they might be moments from launch. The Politburo convened in emergency session. Some urged calm, others demanded preemptive readiness. An internal debate raged not over action, but whether reality itself could be trusted. Then came the worst signal of all. At 06:23 a.m., A Soviet early warning radar in Olenogorsk reported high-altitude infrared activity over the Greenland Sea consistent with U.S. bomber patrol launches. It wasn't confirmed, but it didn't need to be. The picture was clear the Americans were moving and saying nothing. That's when Defense Minister Ustinov reportedly muttered a single phrase. "They've gone dark. That means war." Moscow didn't know about the corrupted relay node. They didn't know the messages were being sent. To them, this was a textbook pre-strike profile. They escalated again. 3 more mobile ICBM units shifted to standby. A missile defense grid in Central Asia went live. A classified naval order rerouted a ballistic submarine to the Pacific. But still, no reply from the Americans. Because to Soviet command, the idea that a simple technical failure could silence the world's most critical communication system was not just unlikely, it was unacceptable. No one wanted to believe the truth that their assumptions were wrong, their systems flawed, and that the most powerful nation on Earth had just been blinded by a wire. It had to be a trick, because if it wasn't, they'd just stared into the abyss by accident. As the Kremlin scrambled for explanations, a more dangerous idea took root, one not born from evidence, but from absence: Soviet military intelligence. GRU Section 7 proposed a chilling theory the United States wasn't silent due to failure. They were simulating communications blackout as part of a decapitation strike rehearsal. The logic was brutal. If the U.S. planned to knock out Soviet command and control in the first wave of a nuclear conflict, cutting the hotline would be the first move. Silence would provoke confusion. Confusion would provoke mobilization. Mobilization would force Soviet systems to activate before centralized command could assess. It would be war by reflex. And it was working. At 07:02 a.m., GRU analysts submitted an emergency memo to the General Staff: probability high strategic deception exercise in progress. Pattern consistent with past U.S. red flag war games. Recommend full spectrum readiness. The KGB added fuel. They cited Western media chatter days earlier about first strike survivability. They noted new American encryption protocols over VLF bands. They interpreted the silence as not accidental, but scripted. And in a war planning state like the USSR, scripting was expected. To Soviet strategists, this wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. The Americans had staged mock blackouts before, during Able Archer, during Autumn Forge. What if this was the next step? What if this time? The drill was real. Suddenly, every radar glitch became evidence. Every delay was reinterpreted. One Soviet admiral pointed at blank SIGINT logs and said, "That's not absence, that's camouflage." With the wrong theory gaining traction, the General Staff issued coded test messages to confirm internal command integrity. Several units failed to respond in time, further proof of U.S. electronic interference. The result: more escalation, more missiles readied, more crews woken in underground silos, but no actual confirmation of anything, just a growing belief that silence was strategy. By 07:45 a.m., a preemptive alert was drafted, an official declaration of strategic readiness level 1. It stopped just short of launch authorization. The only thing that prevented transmission was a single general who demanded 1 more hour. If they attack, it won't matter. If they don't, we'll have just saved the world from a wire's whisper. The hotline still hadn't made a sound. But in the Kremlin, it had already screamed one-word war. As the decapitation strike theory swirled within the Soviet military apparatus, a second and equally destabilizing theory emerged from inside the KGB's Directorate S. The silence wasn't preparation for war. it was a trap. According to this view, the United States wanted the USSR to react to raise its alert level, to move forces, to mobilize missile systems, not to provoke a war, but to frame Moscow as the aggressor. It would be psychological warfare at the highest level. The Americans would let the Soviets escalate first, capture the movements via satellite, and then parade the footage before the world as evidence of a Soviet plan for nuclear aggression, a strategic win without firing a shot. The Kremlin knew the Western press was primed. Only days earlier, UN media outlets had aired segments speculating on Soviet nuclear postures. Some outlets cited Pentagon leaks. Others quoted anonymous intelligence officials claiming the USSR was more reactionary in recent months. The KGB saw a pattern. The Americans weren't coming for a first strike. They were coming for moral high ground and silence. Silence was the perfect bait. This theory spread fast because it aligned with something far older than technology Soviet paranoia. In a regime built on secrets and masks, the idea that the enemy operated by deception was not a flaw. It was doctrine. So what did Moscow do? They went silent. 2. Commanders stopped submitting readiness updates to General Staff. Field units began using pre-authorized standing orders to minimize traceable communications. Submarine captains initiated radio dark procedures. Several radar installations quietly disconnected from the central grid, fearing interception. They feared their own signals could be spoofed. The result was catastrophic, not in explosions, but in opacity. The Soviet Union's military apparatus, normally hierarchical and centralized, fractured into localized silos, each making decisions without knowing what the others were doing. A colonel near Smolensk later admitted, "I saw 3 readiness levels that night. Ours, the one above us, and the one we thought the Americans would see." The Kremlin didn't know where its own submarines were. Missile crews didn't know who had authority. The General Staff lost visibility on half of the strategic airfields, all because they assumed any signal could be a trap. This wasn't escalation by planning. It was escalation by insecurity. And still, no message had arrived. The Americans were shouting into a void, but the Soviets had convinced themselves the void was screaming back. Inside the NSA's operations center in Fort Meade, the story looked very different. Signals analysts had been monitoring Soviet military traffic since the Barents thermal bloom. At first, they saw standard reaction patterns, radar sweeps, early warning activations, repositioning of mobile launchers. But by 0630 EST, the volume and variety of encrypted traffic exploded. To an outside observer, it looked like a country preparing for war. By 0700 EST, NORAD had raised its readiness posture. U.S. Strategic Command ordered increased patrol frequency for airborne nuclear assets. Multiple B-52s were placed on alert status in North Dakota and Louisiana. The logic was classic mirror Soviet readiness to signal deterrence but don't provoke. Yet backroom analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency were panicking. None of this made sense. Why would the Soviets escalate so hard? When they'd received a clear U.S. message about the submarine explosion, why respond to a nuclear accident with near-combat posture? That's when a junior NSA cryptologist, working a side console, noticed something odd in the confirmation logs. There were none. Every outgoing message from the White House Situation Room had been transmitted, but none had been acknowledged by Moscow. The hotline's built-in acknowledgement protocol had not been triggered. No bounce-backs, no handshakes, no negative receipts. To the NSA, this meant one thing: the Soviets hadn't received a single word. An emergency interagency group was convened at the Pentagon. They re-verified every transmission route. The results were damning. The Atlantic cable primary channel was degraded and down. The backup satellite uplink was functioning, but Moscow's receiver hadn't been aligned for months. The telex relay via Frankfurt had been rejected due to outdated cryptographic handshakes. And the final fail-safe embassy courier was still sitting in a diplomatic satchel in a side office, unopened, because it wasn't marked as time-critical. America had sent the message, but the message had gone nowhere. At 07:46 EST, an advisor to the National Security Council summed it up in one line. We thought they were stonewalling. They thought we were attacking, and the truth is we're both flying blind. The realization hit Washington like a second explosion. This wasn't a communications lag. It was an intelligence vacuum masquerading as activity. The hotline hadn't failed them. They had failed to notice it had failed. That distinction was lethal, because every action taken since the thermal bloom had been based on the assumption of mutual understanding. But now, mutual understanding was gone and the Soviets were reacting to shadows. The clock was ticking, and Washington had no idea what Moscow would do next. In a bunker beneath the White House, the architecture of American crisis response cracked but didn't collapse. The primary communication channel, the legendary hotline, had failed, but the U.S. national security structure wasn't built on a single wire. It was a web, and when one strand snapped, others began to flex. At 07:58 EST, a rarely used crisis protocol was activated, Zebra Relay. It bypassed traditional state-to-state communication and rerouted emergency messages through U.S. military attachés, encrypted naval channels, and NATO command nodes. First contact was made through the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki, using a Cold War-era manual cipher. An attaché passed a condensed message directly to a Finnish diplomat with connections inside Moscow's civilian telecommunications grid, the Finns neutral, quiet, and trusted by both sides relayed the message. It worked. At 08:47 a.m. Moscow time, a Soviet deputy foreign minister in a mid-level office opened a nondescript fax, authenticated the encryption stamp, and saw the words, "No aggression, no strike, submarine incident. Stand down recommended." Within 15 minutes, the message was verified through a second independent channel, this time via a NATO relay in Ankara, where an American liaison officer had been working a Turkish comms station since 0400. The Soviet response was swift. Submarine units received a hold command. Mobile missile units were stood down. Air bases were ordered to retain readiness posture, but not escalate. And slowly, the silence cracked. At 09:36 Moscow time, the Soviet teletype station attempted to reinitiate the hotline sequence. This time, the connection failed visibly. Their operators saw what Washington had missed hours earlier. The line was dead. Then came the call from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. A senior aide, out of breath, handed the deputy minister a secure phone. "Sir, this is Ambassador Matlock. Please tell your leadership we've been shouting through a broken pipe. You were never supposed to be in the dark." In Washington, the realization was bitter. Every assumption about protocol, about response time, about strategic clarity had failed. But what hadn't failed was the instinct to find another way. The NSA rerouted encryption keys through U.S. Navy P-3 Orion patrol aircraft stationed off Iceland. A message piggybacked on an anti-submarine net. It was primitive, slow, but it was human. In the end, that's what saved both nations, not a system, but people improvising inside systems that were never designed to fail. At 10:04 EST, the President received the final flash report, "Crisis averted. Message received. De-escalation underway. Moscow confirms peaceful intent, and in the Situation Room, silence returned. Not the dangerous kind, but the kind that follows near catastrophe. The kind of silence earned. Because America's true weapon wasn't just the hotline, it was resilience. And that day, when everything else broke, it was the ability to adapt to reach out in ways that weren't written down that stopped the countdown clock. The crisis had passed. But inside the Soviet command structure, the atmosphere was not one of relief. It was humiliation. Not from the Americans, from themselves. The very system that had been hailed as the pinnacle of deterrence and rational command, structured, centralized, technologically formidable, had failed in its most critical moment. Not because of sabotage, not because of a Western trick, but because of neglect, bureaucracy, and a cable. The Politburo convened a classified post-mortem the following day. What emerged was worse than anyone expected. The hotline's Atlantic segment had been degrading for years. Multiple internal memos, filed by mid-level technicians, had warned of voltage mismatches in Arctic nodes and potential failure points in Icelandic cable links. All had been ignored, passed over, or marked as non-urgent. Worse still, the Kremlin's own communications ministry had rerouted budgetary resources away from strategic upgrades prioritizing optics over operations. The KGB's internal report, never declassified, but leaked years later, summarized it in one sentence. We trusted a system that could not dial when it mattered. The embarrassment spread deeper. Units had moved without coordination. Protocols had contradicted each other. Redundant links proved non-functional. One ballistic submarine had repositioned under assumed wartime orders that had never been given. And then came the American revelation. Washington publicly confirmed the failure had been internal, an electrical relay fault, and quietly offered to fund a joint diagnostic review of the hotline system. It was not an insult. It was a gesture. But to the Soviet military elite, it was a dagger. The Americans had seen the USSR move blindly toward war, unaware that they were reacting to silence, and they had still chosen to warn, to wait, to de-escalate. General Mikhailov, humiliated, allegedly remarked to an aide, "They played chess. We threw the board." It wasn't just a strategic failure. It was an ideological one. The USSR had built its identity on control, on knowing, on commanding, on orchestrating vast systems with military precision. And yet, in the moment that mattered most, that system had scattered into confusion, contradiction, and panic. Some officials demanded heads roll, others called for a total review of the Soviet command and control matrix. A few even whispered the unthinkable. If this could happen once, it could happen again. And next time, no one might wait 3 hours. In the end, the hotline was repaired. Upgrades were promised, but the scar remained, not on the cable, but in the minds of the men who realized they had stood on the edge of annihilation, because a single signal never arrived. The aftermath of the crisis revealed something no doctrine could fix. The Soviet Union's greatest vulnerability wasn't Western missiles or stealth bombers. It was its own illusion of control. In every war game, every rehearsal, every briefing, the USSR taught its commanders that crises would unfold in patterns that communication lines would hold, that logic would rule, that threats would escalate predictably. But in practice, war doesn't follow logic. It dances in uncertainty. And the moment a system relies on perfect information, it's already lost. The hotline failure proved the truth. Soviet leaders never wanted to admit their strategic stability was built on fragile channels, outdated assumptions, and rigid hierarchies that cracked under real pressure. That night, the Kremlin was forced to face a reality more destabilizing than any American warhead they had prepared to fight the United States. But they were not prepared to fight uncertainty. It was the beginning of a quiet unraveling. Within 6 months, internal Soviet reports highlighted over 130 separate flaws in their nuclear communications structure. By the end of the year, reform committees had formed, but were underfunded, undermined, and outpaced by economic decline. The doctrine of strategic confidence, once absolute, was now punctured by fear. Generals hesitated longer. Commanders second-guessed readings. A culture built on decisive strength had tasted paralysis, and it never forgot. The Americans didn't gloat. There was no press conference, no intelligence leak. But within NATO command, the message was clear: the Soviets weren't 10 feet tall. Their system was vulnerable, not to attack, but to silence, and that silence spread. As the Soviet Empire strained under economic collapse, internal rebellion, and technological stagnation, its military elite knew they had crossed a line they could never return from. A moment when peace was preserved not by strategy, but by luck. A moment when one man's hesitation beat the logic of missiles. And in every planning room that followed, in every exercise, every war game, every shift in doctrine, there was a shadow, a quiet memory, a question unspoken. What if the cable had broken 5 minutes later? Years later? When the Soviet Union collapsed, not with an explosion, but with a bureaucratic sigh, no monument was raised to mark the night of the broken hotline. No plaque, no medal, no grand declaration, but in the margins of Cold War history, among cables and decrypted archives, that night remained a silent fracture in a system that had been designed to survive everything except doubt. The cable was replaced, redundancies were built, protocols were rewritten, but the ghost remained not in the wire, but in the logic that allowed the world's most powerful empires to assume they'd always be able to talk. That assumption almost ended civilization. Modern nuclear doctrine, American. Russian, Chinese. NATO still relies on rapid clarity, on channels staying open, on people doing the right thing at 3:00 a.m. when the world shakes. But every so often, in Pentagon briefings or Russian strategic studies, someone brings up the near miss from the 1980s. They speak of it not as a failure, but as a warning, because the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal isn't a missile. It's silence mistaken for strategy. The broken hotline didn't just delay a message. It exposed how thin the line is between global stability and irreversible mistake, and how close we came to learning that lesson too late.